webinar. I'm really thrilled to introduce you to our orgSource Senior Consultant and Myers Briggs Practitioner, Kevin Martlage. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome everybody. I'm really looking forward to going over everything with you today and talking about the exciting world of Myers Briggs and how you can use it within your organizations to help improve team collaboration. So just to start out, there's quite a bit of information I'm going to go through over the next, say 20 to 25 minutes. And as Emily mentioned, I'll be happy to take some questions at the end and even offline afterwards if you have anything that we need to discuss. So just to jump right into it, I'm going to start by giving you kind of a brief overview of what Myers Briggs and the MBTI assessment is all about. And then at the end of this session, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can use those results in that process to help understand and build team collaboration within your organization. So if you look at the, we'll just jump right into it. So if you look at the kind of the definition and what Myers Briggs says about creating high-performing teams to grow your business, it's meant to add a better understanding of themselves and the people they work with. Employees develop a greater respect for and appreciation for one another. And by using effective team-building activities, you can successfully contribute to managing conflict in the workplace while improving overall workplace culture, productivity, and collaboration. So that's kind of just a general overview of what Myers Briggs can bring to your organization in a variety of different ways. And certainly the assessment itself is only the beginning of what you can build upon. So if you look at kind of where the MBTI tool is used, it's currently used in about 80 of the top Fortune 100 companies, and it's considered the most widely used personality assessment in the world. It's also currently translated into 24 plus languages. I say plus because there's some languages they're currently working on. And it's estimated that over 2 million people take the assessment annually in different forms. And so why that's important is to understand that, the Myers-Briggs assessment, being the most widely used personality assessment in the world, is absolutely valid in the way it's developed and also the way it's used. And so the results that you achieve with it are certainly very effective in what you're trying to do as an organization. So in order to understand what Myers-Briggs is about, Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist, developed the theory of personality back in the early 1900s, and it's about a 6 or 7 volume piece of work that is extremely difficult to understand. But thankfully, Catherine Briggs and Isabel Briggs Meyer came along and really saw the benefit of the personality types in his work and translated that into something that was a little bit more effective and understandable and what I call digestible with the Myers-Briggs type indicator instrument. And so beginning in 1943, they developed what is today the Myers-Briggs type indicator instrument and has continued to work with that and develop it over time. So it's been around a long time, and it's based on a lot of research by Carl Jung and how it was developed. So in order to talk about how this can help with team collaboration, you kind of have to understand a little bit about Jung's theory of personality type. And again, this whole session I'm going over today is typically about a 2 or 3 hour session. So I'm going to go through some of this very quickly just to give you a background on how you can use this. So he observed that everyone uses 2 kinds of mental processes: how you take in or gather information, and then how you make decisions excuse me, and coming to conclusions about that information. So that's the basics of what Jung's theory of personality type is. And he understood that everyone has a preferred way of using those mental processes when taking in information and making decisions on it. He also observed that we all live in 2 worlds: the outer world of people, things, and activities, and the inner world of our own ideas, thoughts, and observations. And so everyone has a preference for this and is typically energized by either the outer world or the inner world. And so when you look at type, Carl Jung says that type identifies kind of inborn preferences for directing our energy and using our mind. And it assumes that everyone uses both opposites at different times. But each person has a preference. Both are equally valuable and useful. So this is a lot different than maybe, say, a trait, which is an enduring behavioral habit that's displayed across a variety of situations. So type theory is very important that it talks about the opposites as opposed to the trait or the behavioral habits along with it. So when you take MBTI theory and you start to understand it, and you'll be able to see throughout the presentation how easy it'll be to kind of use this information amongst your team to help collaborate and build, efficiencies and so forth. But MBTI theory builds on and expands Jung's theory that we just talked about. And it describes 4 pairs of opposite preferences, which we're going to go through rather quickly here in just a minute. And these opposites are kind of like our right and left hands. We all use both preferences in each pair, but we only use one more than the other, and we have preferences over one or the other. So the MBTI assessment is designed to indicate our inborn preferences, and it's not designed to measure skill or effects of environment. So one thing that's always a misconception about the Myers Briggs assessment and the outcome is that it's going to show somebody's ability to do something. That is absolutely not what this is designed to do. It's designed more to understand your own personalities and your own type and how you take in information and use that information to make decisions. So if you look at the MBTI preference pairs that's designed in part of this, you have 4 different pairs that you talk about. You have extroversion and introversion. And this is the opposite ways we direct and receive energy. We have sensing and intuition, which is the opposite ways to take in information. And then we have thinking and feeling, which is the opposite ways to decide and come to conclusions. And then finally, judging and perceiving, which are the opposite ways to approach the outside world. So all of these things are what the MBTI assessment looks into and comes up with. And part of that assessment will report out to you what your 4 letters are. And then we would go through a process with each individual and with the team to understand and validate what that assessment says. And we do that by, once you have your assessments, we go through and talk with you individually about validating what that assessment is saying. So if you look at extroversion or introversion, this is how we direct and receive energy. And people who prefer extroversion direct their energy and attention outward and are energized by interacting with people and taking action. Where on the other hand, people who prefer introversion direct their energy and attention inward and are energized by reflecting on their own and others' ideas, memories, and experiences. And as we stated before, we all use both preferences, but usually not with equal comfort. And so you can see just by looking at those 2 differences, how understanding not only yourself in that regard, but also maybe members of your team or your organization, how they take in energy can be very effective as building, a more collaborative and team building type atmosphere. So people who prefer extroversion are kind of drawn to the outside world. They tend to be more sociable and expressive. They prefer to communicate by talking. They work out ideas by talking through them, and they learn best through doing or discussing. And on the other hand, an introversion, like we said, they're drawn to their inner world. They tend to be more private and contained. They prefer to communicate in writing. They work out ideas by reflecting on them. And they learn best by reflection and mental practice. So before we even move on, I'll just ask the question, and we don't have time to get answers, but you can kind of look in your own environment and yourself, which one you may be, tend to prefer over the other as you're going through this. So then we go on to sensing and intuition. And this is the way we take in information and the kind of information we like and trust. And people who prefer sensing focus on present realities, verifiable facts and experiences. And they focus on, intuition focuses on future possibilities, the bigger picture and insights. And just like the other, we all use both ways of perceiving, but we typically prefer and trust one of them more. And so as you dive into the sensing and intuition part of Myers-Briggs, you can start to see, if you understand how people, what they focus on in terms of taking in that information, how effective and powerful that could be if you understand what those types are amongst your team. Specifically, you can look at how people who prefer sensing, they focus on what is real and actual. They observe and remember specifics. They're more factual, concrete, and sequential. And they build carefully and thoroughly towards conclusions. Or on the other hand, intuition, they focus more on patterns and meanings. They remember specifics when they relate to a pattern, are more abstractive, imaginative, and move quickly to conclusions and follow hunches. So those 4 that we just went over are how we as individuals use our personality to take in information from the world around us. And by understanding those 4 things, you can now become very collaborative and very understanding with your organization and with your work group as to how you can relate to each other in order to maximize those things. Now, when we get into the second half is where we start talking a little bit more about understanding how we make decisions based on that information and data that we just received. And so you talk about the next 2 pairs, which is thinking and feeling. This is the way we decide and come to conclusions. People who prefer the thinking make their decisions based on impersonal objective logic. People who prefer feeling make their decisions based on personal priorities and relationships. Both processes are absolutely rational. We use both, but usually not with equal ease. And so as an individual, if you can understand kind of how you go about, processing that data that you've just received and how you come to those conclusions, you can become a little bit more effective in how maybe you portray that to your work group or your other people that you work with in your organization. Specifically, people who prefer thinking like to take a step back to get an objective view. They analyze, they use cause and effect reasoning, they solve problems with logic, they can be tough-minded. Sometimes they can appear to be standoffish even. They're fair and want everyone to be treated equally. Where feeling comes into play, it's you step into identity with those involved, you empathize, you're guided by personal and social values, you assess impacts of decisions on people, and you strive for harmony and positive interactions. So you can see there, if you kind of think about your own personal work group and you specifically which category you may fall into, if you can start to really understand how you're approaching that decision-making process based on the data you're reviewing, you can not only become more effective and efficient in that on your own right, but you can also, as you're understanding your team, start to work on what that looks like in terms of your organization. And then the final thing is judging and perceiving, how we approach our outside world. People who prefer judging, they want the external world to be more organized and orderly, and they look at the world, excuse me, and see decisions that need to be made. Where the perceiving type is they seek to experience the world, not organize it, and they look at the world and see options that need to be explored. Again, we all use both preferences, but usually not with equal comfort. Specifically within judging and perceiving, you have people that on the judging side that are organized, they're very systematic, they're methodical, they make short and long-term plans and follow them, and they try to avoid last-minute stresses. Where people on the perceiving side, they're adaptable and curious, casual, open-ended, adjust flexibility to new information, and feel energized by last-minute pressures. So as you look at the 8 different categories in the 4 different pairs, you can start to see the more you go in to understand each one of those, how you as an individual can rely on your inborn personality preferences to make decisions and take in information, and how you can then work as a group to make that more effective. So when you combine your preferences, it indicates your personality type. And so as we talked earlier, it's one or the other. It's either E or I, S or N, T or F, or J or P. And so when you combine all of those and you've taken your assessment and you've validated exactly what your personality type is, there are 16 different combinations that you can come up with. That are the 16 personality types of the MBTI assessment. And each one of those personality types has specific things that relate to it. And that's where the continual coaching and working with the individuals and the teams really come into play in terms of how you go about really understanding what your personality types are and how they're affecting the way you're taking in information and making those decisions. So how do we use this information to improve team collaboration? That's what we're all here about today. And, I had to go through kind of that brief overview of it just to give you kind of a basis to talk about how you can use that information with your team in terms of improving collaboration. So the MBTI process can help impact team collaboration by improving behavioral awareness, behavioral flexibility, providing a better understanding of others, and improving overall self-awareness. We've covered that so far throughout the session. But the more you can dive into each one of those, the more effective this whole process is going to be in terms of impacting collaboration. So one way that we can utilize this, if you fast forward a little bit and say you have a work group of 10 to 12 people, and we're going to be working with Myers Briggs and the MBTI application with them, is something that we call a living type table. And so I've put together kind of a fictitious organization to kind of show you how you can go about using Myers Briggs in this information that you just received in the assessment to impact collaboration and teamwork. So if you look at the 16 different Myers Briggs personalities that we talked about, and you take your work group and you overlay that into there. And one thing that's important is all of your Myers Briggs information and results is absolutely confidential between you and the practitioner. And so before you would get to this step, you would need to get buy-in from everybody on the work group that they're willing to share this information with everybody else in an effort to improve the team collaboration going forward. So we're going to assume that everybody was on the same page of doing that and agrees to that. We would then drop in everybody's name into their different personality types, so we could start to do some team building and some investigation into how we can utilize those personality types to improve collaboration. So I've just made up some names here and dropped them in there as to where they would be. And you can start to look at, if you look at the individuals in the bottom two rows, those are the ones that have the tendency or personality type to be more extrovert. So they like to speak to think. And in this instance, there's 55% of the team falls into that category, where the top two rows are the individuals that are more introvert, and they like to think to speak, which is about 45%. Now, there's nothing to say that the perfect team is going to be 50-50 or 60-40 or 70-30, but what's important is to understand how each individual plays into that. So as you're interacting with that person, or you're working with that person through a project or whatever it may be, you're understanding their personality types and trying to maximize those types to become more efficient and move the organization or the project forward. So in this instance, you can see Caitlin is an ESTJ. Some of her things that fall into her personality are, from the extrovert side, are they're logical and practical, they're realistic, they're matter of fact, they like to organize themselves and others. Where, for instance, Cindy and Dan, who are ISFJs, they work devotedly to meet their obligations, lend stability to any project or group, loyal, considerate, sensitive, and concerned with how others feel. So both of those are very important people to have on a team, certainly. But you can see very easily by just looking at the first two, pairs, that if you understand how they like to take in that information, and you can maximize how they do that, you can then move that organization forward. And that specific conversation, for instance, may be addressed a little bit differently to help enhance collaboration. So if you go to the next one, you have the right side of the type table is intuition. And those are people who see the world in the big picture, which is about 36% of this team. And then you have sensing on the other two, which sees the world in more details, which is about 64% of this team. So again, if you're looking at Caitlin as an ESTJ, you can see some of the traits there that she shows as being somebody that's on the sensing preference. And Brandon and Neil as ENFJs, who are sociable, diplomatic, empathetic, responsive, and responsible. They try to handle things with due regard for other person's feelings and enjoy being in groups. So you can see as these two, maybe these three individuals are starting to interact in terms of something and taking in information, Caitlin could maybe come across as being very matter of fact, we got to make this decision, here's the facts, where Brandon and Neil may be more, hey, we need to be, before we make any decisions, we may need to collect some more information, or we need to handle things a little bit differently to do that. So one's not right over the other, but if they can start to understand this part of their personalities, the inborn preferences of their personalities, they can certainly start to work together and try to enhance that collaboration. And throughout this whole process, as you're going through this as a team, you're going to be going through and doing different things to try to understand that, which we'll get to here in just a minute. So if you switch over to how people now make decisions on all this information that they've been collecting, you have on the outsides of the type table the thinking preference. These are the logical decision makers. And the inside two columns are the feeling. These are the people-oriented decision makers. And you can see in this case, 73% approximately of this team falls into that category. So if you look specifically at, say, Beth and Buddy, as ENFPs, they're warmly enthusiastic, they're imaginative, they're always finding a new possibility to try, they're empathetic and ready to help anyone with a problem. Where again, Caitlin is more matter-of-fact, realistic. And I don't mean to be picking on Caitlin, that's not my intent. It's just more of using her as an example of how these three individuals may need to be understanding of each other in terms of how they're going to be making decisions based on whatever information is they're doing. And so as a team, you can start to work on, what are some things, some roadblocks or some things that we need to be aware of as we're moving forward. And then the last two, judging and perceiving, you can see at the top and the bottom, rows. These are the people to get things completed and checked off their list, where the middle two are where people like to keep things open. And you can see the examples there on the left of the different personality, types that may come into play in both of those different things. So what's this kind of all about in using type information? So with an organization, if we were to go through this process, or the team was to utilize their Myers-Briggs in this manner, you'd start to ask yourself, what can we do? And what are some action plans that can be developed? And it's very simple. It's what will we do differently? How and when will we do it? Who will take responsibility for championing it? And when and how will we check to see if it's working and making necessary modifications? So the key to all this is once you have your MBTI, your four letters, and you're understanding individually about how you're doing that, you're taking a really hard look at the team itself and how you're going to go about adjusting maybe some of the things that you're seeing in terms of roadblocks that are standing in way of your collaboration. So how MBTI impact on collaboration and leadership? By understanding your types present amongst your team, you can start to identify potential problems and maybe how peers and reporting relationships may perceive each other. You can proactively identify what we call type clashes among the teams and their peers. You can identify where type may get in the way of moving the organization forward both strategically and efficiently. And you can identify how awareness around team preference can create a positive change in culture, collaboration, and productivity. So these are all things that aren't going to happen overnight, certainly. But if you start to really take a critical look at just the personality types that are involved with whatever work group or organization you're working with, and you start to understand those basic things that are inborn preferences to their personality, you can start to make some pretty, I call them life-changing and organizational changing, adjustments to how that work group interacts with each other, just by simply understanding how they like to take in information and how they like to make decisions on that. So there's not just really, hey, I've got my Myers-Briggs type and we've gone through some team building. There's no magic bullet that's going to solve the problem or anything that you're trying to adjust overnight. But what Myers-Briggs can offer is a nice, consistent, very valid baseline for you and your teams to build upon as you try to move your organization forward in terms of collaboration, communication, and improving whatever that work group or those things that you're trying to do. So that's a lot of information. I know I kind of flew through that, but I'll be more than happy to kind of open up to any questions you may have to end the last few minutes that we have here together. And certainly afterwards, if you have any other questions, you can reach out to me directly. Emily can share your information. It's there on the screen as well. I'd be happy to talk with you more about what this could look like within your organization. And even if it's not maybe a work group together, where we might be looking at Myers-Briggs, if there's, I have a lot of people that Myers-Briggs is very effective in terms of personalized coaching with them as well, about how you can become a better leader and how you can better understand your personality types in terms of making you a more effective leader. So with that, Emily, I guess I'll open it up and see if we have any questions that maybe came through on the chat site. I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. We
Mhm.
do have a couple of questions here.
Okay.
The first is, do you have any specific exercises to help a team use this for team building?
We do. The first thing would be is, just the fact of going through the type table that I just showed you together as a team is a great team building exercise in itself. So you kind of achieve two things. You're having a good team building exercise where you're maybe getting everybody together and you're going through this because there's some specific things that, say as a consultant, if I was to come in and to help lead that, we would take them through about a 2 or 3 hour session to kind of work specifically on that type table. So that's the first thing. The other thing is there is a ton of resources available on the Myers Briggs website that you could have access to either free or through your practitioner that could help with the team building. Some other things that organizations have done is you can actually print out, signs so everybody on their office or cubicle has their type. So as you walk into that that office or you're interacting with that person, you're going to kind of know, how you may need to adjust that conversation based on the information and how they're going to make those decisions. So there's all kinds of things that you can kind of build upon once you have that assessment completed. So.
Okay. There's a question that is in that same vein, Kevin. It says, how do you ensure people don't use their Myers-Briggs type as an excuse or obstacle in the workplace?
Well, I think that's one thing that, as you go through and you validate the type with the person. So say, I'm the practitioner and I'm going over yours. There's ethically a lot of things that we go through at the beginning before we validate your type and all that and go through that process to make sure that you're aware of you don't use it for that kind of thing. And as you go through and do the team building, we're constantly trying to make sure that they're aware that this has nothing to do about skill. This has nothing to do about your abilities as a person. And it really comes down to, the senior management or the supervisor or the individuals specifically to ensure that that kind of stuff doesn't happen.
Culture.
We're going to make sure from a practitioner standpoint that everybody understands at the beginning what this is all about and how you can utilize it. But it really has to be the team buying into that concept and holding each other accountable to make sure that that doesn't come up. And I think it's hard to go through it all in just 20 minutes, I'll be honest with you. I think as you go into it more specifically with each one, you'll see that it's kind of difficult to make sure, for that to kind of even enter itself into the conversation. So.
Another question here, how does Myers-Briggs compare to the DISC assessment?
DISC is another one that's out there. There's also True Colors. I'm obviously not certified in DISC. I'm kind of aware of it. One thing I can tell you with Myers-Briggs is how far reaching it is and just the process they go through to develop it, to make sure it's relevant. They follow very strict standards. They have a ton of resources they pull from. They're constantly updating it, so forth. I have to say that I haven't done a physical comparison of the two, but just from my background of developing certifications and things like that, from a psychometric standpoint, Myers-Briggs and the process they go through is kind of above anything that I've come across so far, just understanding how that all works. And they go into that detail as you become a practitioner as to what process steps they go through in terms of making it valid and making sure it's reliable. So.
Okay. 2 more questions on our list.
Okay.
According to the MBTI manual, a large percentage of people who retest within 4 weeks actually change at least one of their letters. Given that, is it fair to use these scores to make decisions about who could have a clash with another team member or who might not be a good fit for taking the organization forward?
Yep. So that's a very interesting point. And one thing about Myers-Briggs that you'll understand as you go through it, specifically, and you're validating your personality types and all that with the practitioner, is this is a journey. Just because it says, for instance, I'm an ISTJ, for instance. I know that as I'm going through and I'm going to continue to understand what that means and how I relate that to my workplace or how I relate that to my family or how I relate that to my friends or whatever. I'm going to continue to understand what that looks like. And I may have to adjust that over time. But I think that's where it's really important if you have maybe a practitioner or you have somebody that really understands Myers-Briggs in depth, can walk you through that and can understand, hey, you know, I know when I took it, the assessment said I was ISTJ, I validated as ISFJ, and now I feel like it's changing here, or, you know, this part of this person's personality really seems to be holding us back. How can we overcome that? I think it starts with the conversation. And it comes back to, you know, Myers-Briggs has nothing to do with ability and nothing to do with how, you know, good somebody is at something. It's more of a self-awareness and an understanding. So it's certainly common to, once you validate that, you may change that as things change down the road within your organization or even your job or your career.
Certainly.